Matthew, thank you so much for joining us from Stepladder UK as part of this Emerging Payments Association Values and Lifestyle Based Banking Report, which is part of Project Inclusion. We're really thrilled to have you with us. So can I start with asking the obvious question in terms of what is Stepladder?
It's a fantastic question because it's the one that can be as long or as short as we have time for, but mindful that you probably have some other questions. The simplest point is we're taking something that's used around the world, a ROSCA, or Rotating and Savings Credit Association, which is used from East Asia through South Asia, the Middle East, Africa, the Caribbean, and Latin America by various local names, including chit funds or committees, Stockvel, Ajo, Tandas, Consorcios, partners. These are many local names for what is essentially a lending circle. This allows groups of people essentially to raise money faster than they would saving by themselves, and translates their individual contribution into something much more powerful, which we call collaborative finance.
Fantastic. And how did you, as Matthew, how did you stumble across it? What's the journey behind founding Stepladder?
I did my graduate school work over 15 years ago on consorcios, specifically in Brazil. So if you want to do a little bit of Googling, if you put my last name together with consorcios, you'll see my thesis is still up on the University of Pennsylvania website. The thing is, seeing consorcios in Brazil and seeing them as a high street banking product there, managed by nearly 160 different operators, whether they're OEMs or local banks or specialist consortium operators, had me realize that this is a scalable product. But the key thing that hadn't happened yet is digitizing it. And so to move the shift from something that is extremely powerful because of behavioral finance and community factors and make it 21st century so that you can engage with a consorcio or a ROSCA directly over your own mobile phone is truly an innovation. And it is really taking a learning from what are typically considered developing countries and bringing it back here to the UK and saying, actually, there's a huge market for this in inclusion and empowerment of the consumer in their personal finance. And that's where we say collaborative finance is really a whole new wave, almost an anti-Klarna kind of wave of people supporting each other to reach their financial goals.
Brilliant, Matthew. And you mentioned the genesis being the work that you did in Brazil. It would be great to get a sense of the communities that you are targeting and the communities that have perhaps already articulated a need for a ROSCA style product and Stepladder to come in and provide those solutions. Describe the community that you are, I guess, targeting or working with.
It's a great question. And I would principally say we see it as several communities that all share something they didn't realize they had in common. I think that's what's really so powerful about the human experience is that many diaspora communities, first, second generation to the UK, all share familiarity with this, but by their local names, whether it's chit funds or committees or it's partners. When we first started doing outreach at Stepladder, even before launching formally in the UK, we would attend things like the First Time Buyer Show. And we would hear folks who were there with their parents, and their parents said actually it was because of a partner that they, who had come to the UK in the 50s and 60s, had first been able to buy their home, or when their right to buy in the 80s had been an opportunity. They didn't have the capital unless they did it through community-based raising, but it was always informal, unregulated, and definitely not digital. And so to be able to offer that for that generation's children who are purely digital, to be able to create those same partners and that same sense of community that the ROSCA provides, that the partner provides, I thought was an opportunity for a real disruption, a real wave across the Afro-Caribbean community, the African diaspora, the Indian and the Pakistani diaspora. But the beautiful thing is so many people know them already. It's just about getting it right to those communities in touch personally and digitally.
Thanks, Matthew. And are you doing anything in particular with your product beyond obviously the obvious in terms of being a ROSCA? And as you say, familiar, especially culturally with some communities more than others. Are you doing anything in particular to tailor it for the needs of some of the communities that perhaps might be more familiar?
Absolutely. I think it's absolutely critical to do two things. One, to as quickly as possible bridge so people recognize it for what it is that they might be already familiar with. make sure that we are approaching through trusted ambassadors. And so a big part for us is community outreach, whether it's digitally in the day and age of Instagram, financial advisors, as well as people who are locally based physically in the community, whether it's through church groups or nonprofits. We love having that degree of outreach. But one of the things that I think is really innovative about what we're doing is targeting a use case. And that use case, our principal introduction of Stepladder, is first for people who are trying to reach the first rung of the property ladder and to help them form their deposits and navigate the journey to home ownership better than if they're by themselves. And so to create purpose-centric ROSCAs that help people accomplish something that is a Maslow level personal need of home ownership is transformational. And the best analogy I've seen has been kind of like the NCT preparing people for having their first child. It's amazing. Everyone's going through this experience for the first time together, and it's great to have that support of a community, and you're empowered by being together and doing so. The other thing that we do are smaller tickets, so 25 or 100 pound a month commitments for those who are in the process of getting used to the habit of setting aside money every month so they can build up something like an emergency fund or a remittance fund for family back home.
Brilliant, Matthew. Thank you so much. And I guess I should have asked this maybe a question or two earlier. Why does the current system, in your opinion, from what you've heard, why does it not serve the needs of some of these communities? What are the challenges that they have with the current financial system as it stands?
It's horrifically, the current system is horrifically transactional. Not only can we talk about tech empowering, but just the degree of familiarity and engagement is sterile. And so to be able to break that down, to create a sense that you are part of a group of people who are on a journey together is unique in the context of ROSCA, and it's intrinsic. It's not a layer that's painted on, but it's the fundamental nature of the interaction in our circles are people who are contributing every month and taking turns drawing that whole pot. And that dynamic of interaction and repetition within a closed group is incredibly empowering. It's the same thing that you get when you enter any kind of course, or we like to often draw the analogy to someone who wants to run their first marathon, joining a running club and therefore being successful in running their first marathon, because as a group, they learn the best practice the first time through, what is good for their body, both from an intake and an exercise perspective, what to expect, because they've never done it before. It's transformational to have that support group that's facilitated by something like our platform.
Amazing, thank you so much. And I guess, as you know, the theme of this report is lifestyle, and values-based banking. What do you think of that as a concept, especially in the current era that we live in? And what do you think its role can be as a means of really allowing financial inclusion to prosper?
I mean, I think that this is the transformative next wave of B2C finance. And we are fond of calling the ROSCA collaborative finance. Our circles are a collaborative financial experience for our members, and a solution that is empowering by the same contributions individuals make to their what would typically be savings pots, transforms the ability for other members of their group and themselves to be able to reach their goals faster and better. And so from my perspective, this wave of us supporting each other is naturally grassroots. It's naturally inclusive. We can create matches of groups, even at the same price point of what people are trying to set aside as a goal. We can create groups that have affinity. An all-women support group has already been started by one of our ambassadors, Natalie. We can have another group of people who have a shared goal in terms of where they want to be buying together their first homes, and they can be empowered in doing so and have some leverage in the process that is otherwise very adversarial for the first-time buyer, by being a group together who are looking at a new development or an area that's being built out. The opportunities to expand this to things like people who need to build up capital for being able to take private rentals and move out of social housing is also there on our roadmap. And so the idea that collaborative finance can have these extended use cases, in my view, is what makes this much more of a fundamental paradigm shift, as opposed to just another one-off product that's out there and me too and slightly better UX. The idea is that collaborative finance is a fundamentally disruptive way for people to interact and to be engaged with their finances in a supportive, empowering way is unique in the marketplace right now.
And you've just prompted a question, Matthew, and forgive me, it's slightly philosophical in nature, which is, I think I love the idea of collaborative finance. How does that juxtapose with a society that promotes individuality, especially when it comes to a neoliberal capitalist system, which is deeply individual? And on money, as a society, certainly where we are talking right now in the UK, it's something that's a taboo that's almost hard to talk about. So how does that cultural paradigm fit with a notion of collaborative finance?
You know, it's a really good question. I almost feel like there are two separate questions there. One is, why are people going to be social about their money? And if you had asked us 10 years ago, would people be social about their health, like the way they're going through cancer treatment? And or if we were to talk about, you know, their health and fitness and going into a Garmin group of other people in their cycling club, the idea is that the human is naturally a social animal, and that social feature is one of our really distinctive characteristics. To tap into that, it can be a huge strength. The behavioral finance insight is that when you know who you're borrowing and lending to, your propensity to default and your ability to stick with your commitment goes through the roof. And we see that in our own data, where the arrears and default rates are a fraction, I mean, less than a tenth of what would have been predicted by credit bureaus who evaluate people just purely transactionally. And so I believe collaborative finance and tapping into the social dynamic is actually very empowering. And those who go through it really take to it. And that's one of the reasons we have such a high renewal rate and such positive Trustpilot experiences coming out of the experience of a Stepladder circle. The other element was much more the capitalism dynamic. And one of the things that I think is really important and why we set up Stepladder as a business was that we wanted to be able to evergreen and grow, and our members' participation in positive experience. So our economics are aligned with working in the world that we find ourselves, but by finding inefficiencies in a broken system, we can create value for our members, for our counterparties who are actually paying most of our economics, and still have a good business ourselves. And an illustration of that would be in the origination of a mortgage. In a transactional market like we live in today, typically people, 7 out of 8 first-time buyers, use a mortgage broker. That mortgage broker knows them for a matter of weeks, 4 to 6 weeks on average. And that mortgage broker is incentivized by the commission they're paid by the lender. They value throughput and ease of placing the mortgage in order to facilitate their own personal economics. Our typical member is with us for a year plus. And in that time, we have proprietary knowledge of their interaction. We have that last mile relationship where they're part of our community and engaged with each other and with Stepladder. And so to be able to facilitate the introduction of that individual to a mortgage provider alongside a mortgage advisor who provides that separate function, but to be able to facilitate that origination of the mortgage translates into better quality mortgage lending for the lender, a member who gets a better deal than they would have just being a stranger, and a better experience of taking out that mortgage than they would in a transactional marketplace like they experience alternatively. And so that's where we can release significant value for every part in the transaction simply by finding huge inefficiencies that exist today in the commercial landscape.
Matthew, thank you. And it makes complete sense to me, that idea of, humans being social animals and that familiarity reducing things like defaulting. It makes complete and utter sense. So how do you see the landscape of financial services changing through the development of banking and financial propositions like yours and the ones that you've heard about in this space?
I think 2 things are happening in quick succession. We've created a real counterpoint, and one that's based on solid foundations because it is economic and it is self-sustaining and it has the potential for this kind of viral geometric growth to the transactional marketplace. And so coming from an asset management background like I do, there's a place for the index fund, and then there's a place for the very specialist active manager who finds massive dislocations, inefficiencies in the market the index fund can't replicate. And those two coexist and they create essentially a balance in the portfolio. Something similar to, and I believe that creating something that is naturally inclusive and community-led and empowering exists on the spectrum specifically for these long-term goals that people are trying to reach, whether it's in building up a savings pot, trying to make a large ticket purchase, also potentially for insurance as well. And that exists as a naturally social and collaborative space. And it exists in contrast to a high efficiency tech-led transactional space like foreign exchange, where you're going on a trip and you just want the tightest spread you can. That makes sense to be transactional. But something that you're trying to reach a goal over months or years, you want support. It naturally lends itself to being community-led, and those two things can live in tandem to each other. But I believe that what we've done is we've created critical mass where we've created a real counterpoint to the purely transactional mindset for finance, which the consumers are hungering for.
Thanks, Matthew. And I just to ask this question one more time, because I think it's an important one, especially for those who are going to be listening and watching and reading the report that we will be writing from part of this, is to really articulate the obstacles. I think what you've described amazingly well is how the current financial system, of course, is a hindrance and provides blockers because of its transactional nature to some individuals and maybe to some communities more than others. And I think the ROSCA system that you've articulated is almost designed to help everybody, with some communities more in mind than others. I'd love to maybe just get your sense on that. Are there some communities that you feel are more likely to be disengaged or to have more friction with the current financial system than others? And is that partly the rollout plan for you in the UK and I'm sure in many other countries?
Exactly. I mentioned diaspora communities, and here in the UK, we experienced it in particular with the Windrush generation being locked out of traditional lending. And ironically enough, that was a replay of something that happened 100 years before, which is what gave birth to the original building societies, whether it's Barclays, which is a corporate bank now, but started off very much as a community-based financing organization, or Nationwide, who is a building society, is very fond of talking about its roots as ultimately its own form of a ROSCA. And so the idea is that there's new generations of people who feel disenfranchised from the system are constantly rediscovering community-based inclusive finance. And we believe that that needs to now become digital as well. And so we see ourselves as the inheritors of that next iteration of the same cycle that the society creates for itself, because it needs it. It needs interactive, collaborative finance. People need to have a relationship with each other in the financial dimension like they do in health and fitness. And I fundamentally believe that targeting those communities for whom the current system is not structured, not inclusive, that creates barriers, is exactly where our opportunity lies. And so diaspora communities have been a huge part of our accelerating growth.
Fantastic. And my last question to you, and especially when you talk about the communities that you are engaging with and who perhaps understand deeply because of that generational link to this type of financial system and collaborative finance, how do you go out of your way to listen to your audience and to your customers?
That's a great question. It's a lot of our fundamental design of Stepladder is to essentially make digital and therefore scalable the intake and matching of people. But the matching is where we begin to find groups that by being put together will have better performance than those individuals would experience on their own. Not just because they're connected to each other, but who's connected to whom. And that's really powerful. I think of ourselves a little bit like the admissions department to a really competitive, graduate maths program. And you want to create a cohort that together is going to push the frontier of knowledge and learning in their studies. And that's very much our thought process behind the IP in the matching that we're doing. And that is the natural network effect. The more people that we have coming in to Stepladder every single month, and now we have applicants in the hundreds every month, we can create better and better matches. And that means the group is tighter and performs better. And that becomes essentially a self-perpetuating, strengthening circle. And then the result is when people finish Stepladder circles, especially those who start with what we call our first steps, so 25 or 100 pounds a month, we find them coming back and say, I've been able to have an emergency fund for the first time in 20 years of working. And now I want to be able to reach another goal. My next goal is to be able to buy a car so that I can start taking a job further away, but it's an opportunity that I haven't been able to take before. And so you see people empowering themselves to reach their next goal and, no pun intended, laddering up to bigger and bigger goals as a result of this empowering experience with their finances, as opposed to one where the stock alternative is literally a savings account, which is sterile and neutral and pays no interest.
Absolutely. Matthew, fascinating. That's all that questions we had. Thank you so much for participating in our EPA Project Inclusion Values and Lifestyle Banking interview. I really look forward to seeing this contribution in the report and seeing your growth. I think what you're doing is incredible, and I think is of benefit to many communities up and down the country and beyond. So thank you very much.
It is absolutely our pleasure. And if there's anything I would lastly close with is, please check out our trust pilots, because no one says better our members about the impact that we have on them.